Relevance Theory, Deirdre Wilson and Dan Sperber. Abstract. This paper outlines the main assumptions of relevance theory. Sperber and Wilson 1985, 1995, 1998, 2002, Wilson and Sperber 2002, An Inferential Approach to Pragmatics. Relevance theory is based on a definition of relevance and two principles of relevance, a cognitive principle that human cognition is geared to the maximization of relevance, and a communicative principle that utterances create expectations of optimal relevance. We explain the motivation for these principles and illustrate their application to a variety of pragmatic problems. We end by considering the implications of this relevance theoretic approach for the architecture of the mind. Deirdre Wilson is a highly influential British linguist and cognitive scientist, best known for co-developing relevance theory with French anthropologist Dan Sperber. This theory, laid out in their seminal 1986 book Relevance, Communication and Cognition, proposes that human communication is driven by the search for optimal relevance, where an utterance generates cognitive effects with minimal processing effort. Her work focuses on linguistic pragmatics, studying how contextual factors and intentions interact with linguistic meaning to interpret utterances. Wilson's contributions have significantly impacted the philosophy of language and continue to influence fields like psychology and artificial intelligence. Deirdre Wilson was born in 1941 in England. She completed her Bachelor of Philosophy at the University of Oxford, where she worked with philosopher H.P. Grice. She later earned her Ph.D. from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology (MIT), with linguist Noam Chomsky serving as her dissertation advisor. Following her studies, she was a lecturer at Somerville College, Oxford. Presuppositions and Non-Truth Conditional Semantics 1975 is a foundational academic work by Wilson that delves into the aspects of meaning in language that do not directly contribute to the truth or falsity of an utterance. In this book, she examines linguistic elements that convey information without affecting the truth conditions of a sentence, exploring how such non-truth conditional devices contribute to the overall understanding and interpretation of communication. This early work laid important groundwork for her later, more extensive contributions to pragmatics. Ordered Entailments, An Alternative to Presuppositional Theories 1979, co-authored with Dan Sperber, represents an early and crucial step in the development of their pragmatic framework, moving away from traditional notions of presupposition. In this paper, they argue that the presuppositional behavior of sentences can be accounted for by considering the ordering of a sentence's entailments, rather than positing separate presuppositional devices. They propose that syntactic, lexical, or phonological features of a sentence impose an ordering on its entailments, and that the pragmatically most important entailments, those central to the utterance's relevance, are brought to the forefront, thus offering a more unified and economic account of these phenomena. Modern Linguistics, The Results of Chomsky's Revolution 1979, while mentioned in a few biographical summaries, this book is less frequently discussed than her core pragmatics texts. Given her PhD advisor was Noam Chomsky, this early work likely reflects her engagement with generative linguistics and her perspective on the transformative impact of Chomsky's theories on the field before her full immersion into pragmatics. It provides context for her intellectual foundations. On Choosing the Context for Utterance Interpretation 1985, another collaboration with Dan Sperber, delves into the dynamic and inferential nature of context selection in utterance interpretation, a core tenet of what would become relevance theory. This article challenges the idea that context is predetermined or fixed, arguing instead that the context for interpreting an utterance is a psychological construct, a set of assumptions that the hearer actively retrieves or constructs during the comprehension process. It emphasizes that this context is not static but dynamically evolves, guided by the hearer's pursuit of optimal relevance, demonstrating how expectations of relevance drive the selection and expansion of contextual assumptions. Relevance, Communication and Cognition 1986, co-authored with Dan Sperber, is the seminal text introducing relevance theory. This book posits that human communication is an inferential process guided by the principle of relevance, where speakers aim for optimal relevance, meaning their utterances are designed to yield maximum cognitive effects for the hearer with minimum processing effort. It fundamentally reshaped the field of pragmatics by proposing a cognitive, rather than purely social, account of how meaning is conveyed and understood, moving beyond Gricean maxims. Slave of the Passions 1992 is Deirdre Wilson's novel, set in the 1960s, and follows the story of Grace Ritchie, an intelligent and attractive student at Somerville College, Oxford, who feels alienated from the world. Her journey takes her to Greece and then London as she grapples with her life's direction and complexities, including her relationship with Andrew Lyle. This work offers a fictional exploration of human experience, distinct from her academic research but potentially reflecting underlying interests in human psychology and relationships. Linguistic Form and Relevance 1993, co-authored with Dan Sperber, this article likely explores the precise relationship between the encoded linguistic form of an utterance and how relevance guides its interpretation, potentially delving into specific grammatical or lexical features. Pragmatics, Modularity and Mind Reading 2002, co-authored with Dan Sperber, examines the cognitive architecture underlying pragmatic interpretation. They argue that understanding a speaker's meaning is ultimately an exercise in mind reading, involving the inferential attribution of intentions. Critically, they propose that this process is not simply a general cognitive ability applied to communication, but rather involves a dedicated comprehension module with its own specialized principles and mechanisms, offering an evolutionary perspective on its development. Truthfulness and Relevance 2002, a joint work with Dan Sperber, challenges the widespread assumption that verbal communication is governed by a norm of truthfulness, particularly at the literal level. They argue against existing explanations for the common occurrence and acceptability of loose talk, hyperbole, and metaphor. Instead, they propose that communication is primarily governed by expectations of relevance, and that both literal and figurative uses of language are interpreted through the same relevance-driven inferential processes, without needing to appeal to a prior maxim of truthfulness. Metaphor, Relevance, and the Emergent Property issue 2006, also with Robin Karsten, specifically tackles the phenomenon of emergent properties in metaphor interpretation, those aspects of meaning that seem to arise from the interaction of words rather than being inherent in individual words. The authors argue that these emergent properties are not mysterious or distinct, but are inferentially derived through the regular processes of relevance theory, as the hearer seeks to construct an interpretation that yields sufficient cognitive effects at a reasonable processing cost. Concepts 2007, co-authored with Robin Karsten, explores the nature of concepts and how they are accessed and adjusted during language comprehension within a relevance theoretic framework. This article delves into how lexical items, even in seemingly literal uses, undergo pragmatic processes like narrowing and broadening to form ad hoc concepts that best fit the context and satisfy the hearer's expectations of relevance. It emphasizes that concept formation in communication is a dynamic and inferential process. A Deflationary Account of Metaphor 2009, co-authored with Dan Sperber, presents a view that challenges the traditional understanding of metaphor as a special or distinct linguistic phenomenon. From a relevance theory perspective, they argue that metaphor interpretation is not fundamentally different from other forms of language comprehension, such as loose talk or hyperbole. Instead, they propose that metaphors are interpreted through the same general inferential processes guided by the search for optimal relevance, implying there's no unique mechanism specifically for understanding figurative language. The conceptual procedural distinction, past, present, and future 2011 likely sole authored. This paper delves into a specific technical distinction within relevance theory, between conceptual meaning which contributes to the propositional content and procedural meaning which guides the processing of an utterance. While foundational to the theory, this particular article might not be as widely read as the broad overviews of relevance theory itself. Meaning and Relevance 2012, another collaboration with Dan Sperber, serves as a comprehensive update and expansion of relevance theory. This book further explores the intricate relationship between encoded linguistic meaning and inferred speaker meaning, arguing that words never fully encode what is intended. It delves into how comprehension is achieved through inference guided by expectations of relevance, and it addresses the nature of explicit and implicit communication, challenging traditional distinctions like that between literal and figurative language by proposing a continuum of interpretation. Deirdre Wilson passed away on March 9, 2020, at the age of 78. Her death marked the loss of a pioneering figure in linguistics and cognitive science. She left behind a profound academic legacy, particularly through her co-development of relevance theory, which continues to influence the study of human communication. In the words of cognitive scientists Deirdre Wilson and Dan Sperber, relevance yields positive cognitive effect. Something is relevant if it gives you new information, if it adds meaning to your life, if it makes a difference to you. It's not enough for something to be familiar, or connected to something you already know. Relevance leads you somewhere. It brings new value to the table. Nina Simon. Meaning and Relevance, Introduction, Pragmatics Dan Sperber and Deirdre Wilson. Pragmatics is often described as the study of language use, as opposed to language structure. In this broad sense, it covers a variety of loosely related research programs ranging from formal studies of deictic expressions to sociological studies of ethnic verbal stereotypes. In a more focused sense, the one we will use here, pragmatics contrasts with semantics, the study of linguistic meaning, and is the study of how contextual factors interact with linguistic meaning in the interpretation of utterances. Here we will briefly highlight a range of closely related, fairly central pragmatic issues and approaches that have been of interest to linguists and philosophers of language in the past 30 years or so. Pragmatics, as we will describe it, is an empirical science, but one with philosophical origins and philosophical import. References to pragmatics are found in philosophy since the work of Charles Morris 1938, who defined it as the study of the relations between signs and their interpreters. However, it was the philosopher Paul Grice's William James Lectures at Harvard in 1967 that led to the real development of the field. Grice introduced new conceptual tools, in particular the notion of implicature, in an attempt to reconcile the concerns of the two then dominant approaches to the philosophy of language, ideal language philosophy and ordinary language philosophy, on the philosophical origins of pragmatics. See Recanati 1987, 1998, 2004a, 2004b. Ideal language philosophers in the tradition of Freya, Russell, Carnap, and Tarski were studying language as a formal system. Ordinary language philosophers in the tradition of the later Wittgenstein, Austin, and Strawson were studying actual linguistic usage, highlighting in descriptive terms the complexity and subtlety of meanings and the variety of forms of verbal communication. For ordinary language philosophers, there was an unbridgeable gap between the semantics of formal and natural languages. Grice showed that the gap could at least be reduced by drawing a sharp distinction between sentence meaning and speaker's meaning, and explaining how relatively simple and schematic linguistic meanings could be used in context to convey richer and fuzzier speaker's meanings, consisting not only of what was said, but also of what was implicated. This became the foundation for most of modern pragmatics. References: Wilson, Professor Deirdre Susan Moyer, Who's Who Online Edition, Oxford University Press, December 2017. Retrieved June 19, 2018. Deirdre Wilson. uio.no Wilson, D. N. Sperber, D. Meaning and Relevance. Cambridge University Press. 2012 Wilson, Deirdre 1991. Slave of the Passions, Deirdre Wilson, 9780330325776, Amazon.com, Books. Picador. ISBN 0330325779.